everyone. So we'll be discussing next all about list. Okay. So far in our in this subject in general, we have been talking about algorithms. Okay. So algorithms, it is a set of rules or steps used to solve a problem. So when we are programming, basically what we're doing is we're just creating equivalent solution or equivalent code for let's say sample problems. Let's say get the average of three numbers. Okay, we get the sum of two numbers, or let's say we extract a certain text from a string. So when we are doing this, okay, we are essentially just following steps. Okay, steps that associates to the correct solution. Okay, so diba when we add two numbers, we get to first enter one number, then we get to enter another number. Then since we already have two numbers, next is we use the addition operator. Then finally we get to perform the operation, then we get to display that, diba? So that is a very basic way of programming. Okay, so when we're doing that, we are essentially following an algorithm. Then we are trying to convert that, since we are using Python in our as our programming language. So we are creating codes that would be equivalent to that algorithm. Later on, as you progress with your course, you will know more about data structure. Okay, so data structure is a particular way of organizing data in a computer. So ibot pasabot ani. Okay, so far, di ba, in our previous examples, in our previous programming activities, di ba, we are storing data, okay, in our variables. And variable it could only store one value at a time. Okay, so using data structure, okay, we will be talking about list. Okay, list is probably the most basic, practical way of organizing data. Okay, the main limitation of using a variable is you could only store one value at a time. Okay, so before we talk about list, okay, list actually belongs to a group of data structures called a collection. Okay, so before we talk about what a collection is, we should talk about what is not a collection. So most of our variables have one value in them. So when we put a new value in a variable, the old value is overwritten. Okay, so we could not say that this is a collection. Kay a collection, what it means by a collection here is we have multiple values at a given time. Okay, or stored in a specific place in our program or in our computer. Diba? So when we are programming like this, if you're going to write this line of code next, it would be overwritten. So I hope by now you get the idea of this. Okay, so every time you use the same variable, then you add a new value for it, okay, it will be overwritten. So if you're going to print x, if you're going to make that run, okay, as you get to see, you have a value of 4. Okay, so nawala na to iyahang previous nga value, which was 2, since it has been overwritten by a new value of 4. So that is not a collection, really. So what is happening here is you're only storing one value at a time. Now, a list is a kind of collection. So a collection, again, it allows us to put many values in a single variable. So a collection is nice because we can carry all many values around in one convenient package. Okay, we have the name of our variable here, our list variable. Then at the right side are the values. Okay, as you get to see, medyo lahi na yung itsura. Now what happens here is this, let's say we have a friends variable here. So inside this square brackets, okay, these are the values. So you get to see, if you get to observe, they are separated in comma. So if we could count those separated in comma, we have a total of 3 values here. So we have friends for Joseph, Glenn, and Sally. Okay, so similarly, we have another variable here named carry on. So na po siya socks, shirts, and perfume. So you should be mindful of this syntax. Now, the same with variables, okay? How we could store different values in our variables. We could also store constants, okay? So again, constants, these are fixed, initially fixed values that we get to store in our variable. Now, list constants are surrounded by square brackets and the elements in the list are separated by commas, as what I have mentioned earlier. Now, the thing here is a list element can be any Python object, even under another list. So in the previous example, you get to see these are all string. Kaya naman siya mga single quotes. But you could actually store different types of data in the same list variable. So, and also a list can be empty. So, kane. So we could have, let's say, again, how are you going to declare a list? How are you going to uh, tell Python that you are using a list? Okay, you are using, or you should use, square brackets. Kani. Okay. So let's say in this example, print. Okay, we are directly printing a list constant here. So let's say 1, 24, and 76. So if we're going to make this run, okay, I'll be using since using the online editor is somewhat slow, so I'll be using Visual Studio Code. Okay, so I'm going to paste it here. So again, what we're doing here is you are printing a list which contains 3 values, 1, 24, and 76. Since we want to use this as a numeric data type, so of course we should not use single quotes here. If you're going to do so, then this would be treated as a string or string literals. So if we're going to make this run, so as you get to see, yung gipakita diha. Okay, 1, 20, as you get to see here, it prints the entire list. Later on, we get to learn how to extract specific item from a list. Okay, so again, it is also possible that let's say if you want to store this in a variable, so we could do so. So we should refer to this as a list variable na dayan. Okay, so a variable that contains a list. So if we're going to copy this here and replace that with x, okay, so it essentially arrive with the same thing. So if you're going to make this run, so you get to see parehas ra. Now, you could also, okay, let's say if we're going to add another value here that is not of a numeric data type or an integer data type, so pwede pod. So we get to say here 5. Or we could add here a floating point value. So let's say 76.89. So still, this will not cause an error. It will accept this as a valid data structure. Then, once you're going to print this, it will print the entirety of the list. Okay? So if you're going to make this run, so as you get to see, iyahara ng display. So again, when you're going to store or when you're going to have a list as your value, okay, then you need to use this square brackets here. Okay, that's very important. And they should be separated by space. So if you observe na ay space, it's separated by comma. So you could add space after the comma. So it's up to you. But it doesn't really affect the code. Okay? As you can even see here, yan ang ibutang space daan. So with or without space, it's okay. Now, in case you have been using list, okay, of course you get to identify now that list are if you get to see square bracket, so most definitely you are using list in Python. Now, if you are familiar with other programming languages, there are also other forms of collection. Okay, some programming language have a similar data structure such as arrays. Saka na, no, mara sila. List and arrays are similar but not entirely the same. Okay, their implementation is different. But since we are using Python, uh, Python doesn't use arrays. We are using list as a term for this type of collection. And also, list is not the only form of collection in Python. So later on, we'll get to discuss dictionaries and tuples. Okay. So going back, so if you have been, let's say, tasked to, let's say, I think this has been used previously. If not, then you could actually use list as a form of in partnership with loops. Okay, so actually loops and list goes hand in hand. So for this example, di ba, if you're going to write for I in, okay, 5 4 3 2 1, okay, then print I. Then after that is being printed, after mahuman na print ang 5 4 3 2 1, when we are going to write blast off. So what's going to happen here is individually, okay, I hope you are not confused with this syntax sa for, okay, sa toang loops. So permente ginata ni makita when we are using list. Okay, every time we are going to iterate. So in this case, we are going to iterate across the entirety of our list. So yan ang tagsa-tagsaon. So for I in this list, okay, it would be assigned every iteration kaniuna. Then after that is being executed for the first iteration, the second iteration kana na po niyang i-pull out, then until ma-exhaust niyan ang content sa list. That's why we have this output here. So if we're going to make this run, so we should expect that it's the same. Diba? Kana. So you might have been using list, especially for those contents for those problems that utilize loops. Okay? So again, list and definite loops, okay, could be considered best pals, meaning they work hand in hand. Now, there could be two, okay, if you want to, let's say, diba, going back to our example nga kato kita to ang mga friends nga gi-identify. Okay, let's have another example para kita na to na this is working, okay? If we are using our own example. So Juan, Pedro, and Maria. Okay. So let's say we have that list, and ideally we should assign that as a variable. So let's say friends. Okay. Now it's a convention. Okay, it's a common convention that when we are talking about list, since this is a collection of multiple data, it makes sense that the variable holding this multiple data should be in plural form, di ba? So we have let's say you have a total of 3 friends here, so namely Juan, Pedro, and Maria. Okay, now with that analogy, with that type of thinking, okay, we could write something like this. Okay, so for friend in friends, okay, sabot pasabot ani, di ba, whenever you're going to use this type of looping statement, kaya itong definite loop, di ba, we are pulling one data from a collection one at a time. Okay, so one data at a time. Now remember, Python doesn't really care if you're using plural or singular at this point, but this makes it easier to read for you as a human, di ba? Murag kung Bisaya na to ni taga amigo nato sa ato ang mga amigo, Hindi ba nga na? So for friend in friends, we want to, let's say, greet them. Okay? So we could greet them happy birthday. Okay? So happy birthday, happy birthday. Then ang ngalan sa to ang amigo, which is ato ang gitag sa tagsa, so ato ibutang diha ang tinag sa tagsa nato nga amigo nga atong i-greet. But of course, since we are using a loop, this would iterate to this list of friends that you have here. Okay? So, kung pag humanin nyo greet, let's say, again, this is for the sake of an example and hoping that you get to identify the proper usage of this type of code. So, let's say, asa man ang kaon. So, kana. So, if we're going to print this out, so you get to see, yun siya, happy birthday, Juan. Okay, well, let's change the spacing here. Let's remove this para dili kay dako ang space. Okay, so kana, happy birthday Juan, happy birthday Pedro, happy birthday Maria. So after that has been iterated, asa man ang kaon. Okay, so if you as a person, you are going to read this, okay, it is somewhat intuitive. Okay, nga para sa tong gikan kanina, if you could read this as taga-amigo nako sa ako ang mga amigo. Okay, ingnan nako og happy birthday, then kung mahumanan nako greet tanan, mangutana day kog asang kaon. Okay, so with that in mind, you could use any variable. Okay, let's say in this example, ingani, di ba? We could replace this as A. Okay, then we could replace this as B, then C. Ang importante lang gid ani, especially if nakakita mo example online, then it's not that intuitive for you, but you get to identify which variable is which. Then you must know that kana most likely kanang second variable, the variable after the 4, that would be the iterating variable, in which in every iteration diha store ang value nga iyang gina-pull out sa atoang collection, which is found in the second in the variable after the word in here. Okay, so of course unsa man tang gabiton dere, B or C? Since atong gusto ipakita diha is atong tinagsa-tagsa per iteration, then we should use B. Okay, so if we're going to print this out, actually this should not be C, this should be A. Ano man, di ba? We are looking into this list. Okay, so we should not use another variable which in this case doesn't exist. So A atong gamiton diha. So for B in A, again, this will be the iterating variable, then this would be the list that we are iterating from. So we're going to greet them, then after that, after it has exhausted all the list, then iyang i-print sama ng kaon. So if we're going to make this run, so you get to expect the same output. Okay? So mao na ang common implementation with list and definite loops. So, now that we get to print, okay, we get to know how to create a list, we get to know how to iterate through the list, but how do we uniquely identify items in our list? Kay it's not always the case nga sige lang tag-print sa tanan, di ba? Sometimes gusto na to i-print ang first na to ang first atong item, okay, or second or third or and so on. Okay, natay gusto i-extract nga data. Now, list behaves very similarly, okay, with strings, okay, but there is a key difference from them. Okay, we'll discuss that later. Now, just like strings, we can get at any single element in a list using an index specified in square brackets, diba? If you remember, we have been using square brackets as part of our codes, especially when we were using strings. Okay? Since strings and lists are somewhat similar in a way, then some of the codes could be applicable. in our list. Okay, so unsa may ti mailhan. Now the thing here is, in every item in our list here, they are numbered from 0 to until the essentially the length or the total number of members minus 1, di ba? So what I mean by this is, okay, so since tulo man ato ang amigo dere sa tong listahan, ang pinakauna ana niyang let's say ID, or ang we should call this as index. Okay, the first item in our list will have index 0, and the last item of our list would be the total number of items minus 1. So in this case, ayon ra computon, di ba? It's 3 minus 1. So it's 2. Okay, I hope wa mo nalibog. Tulo ka buok, okay? Tulo ka buok number of items or members in our list, but they are numbered or they are indexed in a way that the first member would be 0, then the last would be the total number of items minus 1. Of course, it would be following a increment of 1. So 0, 1, 2. Okay? So using the same example, let's just change this to friends. Ito na barkada. Okay? To make it more memorable. Ana. So let's say we want to retrieve. Okay? We want to retrieve Pedro. And since ikaduha siya, then 0, 1. So we get to use print. Now how are you going to pull out? Okay? Pull out specific members of our list. Okay? What we need to do is, okay, the name of our list, then followed by the index in between square brackets. Okay? So, is you get to observe na ay multiple usage ang square brackets. It's important that you get to know when that is being used as a part of a list structure and when that is being used when it's pulling out, okay, or when you are going to specifically extract let's say a certain member in our list. Okay, so dapat ninyo na identify readily. Okay, so if you want to pull out Pedro, okay, we use the name of our list, then the index number. Unsa may index number ni Pedro? Since ikaduha siya, so 0, 0, 1. So we put 1 here. And if you want to print that out, okay, print kana. So if we're going to make this run, we get to expect that Pedro would be printed out there. So yan na lang. So of course, if you want to know who is your first friend in your list, okay, so yan na. So we will make this run. So 1. Diba? It's not always the case that you have a list, you know who the first person is, but let's say if you want to know the first person in your in the program, in your program that you're creating, so you could readily use the 0 index, okay, as the first. Now, this is the main difference, okay, the important difference between strings and list. Okay, lists are mutable. Okay, so with that, strings, we refer to them as immutable. So buot pasabot ang mutable and immutable. Mutable meaning pwede nimo malahi, pwede nimo ma-update, or pwede nimo malahi ang content sa list. Okay, in contrast to strings that are immutable. So we cannot change the contents of a string, so we must make a new string to make any changes. Buot pasabot ani, dili nimo readily ma-update ang actual nga list or ang actual nga string. Okay, we could only do so by, let's say, performing string methods, string functions, then assigning it to a new string. Okay, So lists are mutable. We can actually change an element of a list using the index operator. Remember how we access different members of our list using the index operator? So kaning ingani, you could actually change the contents of that. Okay? So since we're working with a list here, let's first try that out. So we could actually say that kinsahay di na mo amigo ni Maria. Okay, gipulihan na nimo og sa tawag ani, si Juliana. Okay? So barkada, let's say kinsa ikapila man na si Maria. That's actually ikatulo. But since remember how it's being indexed, so that we should use the number 2 here. Okay? So let's say ingana. Now what happened here really is this third item here has been replaced with this value here. So if you're going to print, okay, kung i-print na to ang barkada, diba? We could readily print the entirety of our list using this code here. We're going to do that. So as you get to see, nawala na si Maria. She has been replaced by Juliana. Okay? Now that is not the case with strings, even though they are similar in a way that you could index them, okay? And some methods are applicable, string methods can be applicable to list methods, but strings are immutable, meaning dili nimo malahi. Okay? Let's say we have a string. So let's comment this out. Oops. Ito na i-delete. So let's say we have fruit. Okay, fruit. Then let's say we have banana. Okay, we could not do something like this. Okay, we could not do. Let's say, let's try printing. How do we print? Okay, before we attempt to change, if it's possible, diba? How do we print the first letter here? Okay, diba? It's very similar in a way that we use the name of the string here. Remember, we are using a string variable here. So if we're going to put the index operator 0 here, if we're going to print that out, that would return the value B. But you could not actually change that. Okay? Let's say gusto nimo i-lower case ang B. So let's say gusto nimo ingani, fruit diba? Mao na letter B. Gusto nato ipagamay. Since you are using a string variable here, this would not be allowed. This will return an error. So you get to see traced back. Okay, string object does not support item assignment. Okay, or it does not support, okay, changing of its value. Okay, so kana. Now it's different from doing it like this, diba? Let's say x is equal to fruit dot lower. Okay, what happened here is it didn't replace or it didn't change the values that is stored in the string variable here. Wala niya naghihimog dako tanan, gamay tanan, but it just transformed that. Okay, it made a reference to this variable, okay, using another, let's say a part of your memory in the computer. Paggamit niya ana, okay, nanay murag na allocate dito temporarily nga naka lowercase ra nga banana, but it hasn't been changed here. Wala gid na siya nalahi diri sa tong content. Now since the result of this is temporarily being held as part of a memory that you want to access, then you could assign a value or a variable, a different variable for that para kung unsay resulta anang gilower niya ang value aning fruit, but then again wa niya nagilahi ha, iharang gilower tanan characters ana, then somewhere in your memory temporarily that has been made, then you want to store that in a variable that you could use in your program. That is why naani siyang assignment. Then you get, when you're going to print that variable that you used for storing that string operation, which is lowering all the case or characters in that word. So oops, x fruit, let's okay, of course it returned an error kay na pa ni siyang line of code. So if we're going to remove that, so sige to see kana. So ang output dere, okay, ang output dere is derived from this variable here. It is not derived from this variable here nga nalahi. Okay, so I hope mo nalibog. What I'm trying to show here is, okay, strings are immutable. You cannot change the values that have been already assigned in a string variable, even though list and strings are related in a way that some methods, some functions could be used between them. Okay, di ba? Pwede na to ma-pinpoint ang first nga. Okay, we could actually consider this as somewhat like a list, but separated lang sila sa ilang different characters. Okay, then kani murag mauni ang iyang brackets, but since we are using strings and we want to identify that value as a string, so nga na. Okay, so again, strings are immutable, dili nimo na malahi ilang contents ana. Okay, so sa may example dere, Lotto. So if we're going to make use of that example, say Lotto is equal to ano eh, say Suertres. So gusto nato ibutang ang result, let's say 233, 434, 565, 222 kana. So again, we could, okay, if we're going to print this out, so this part of a code, it would print the entirety of our list. Let's say if we're going to change, okay, since we are using a list, this is possible. Let's say we're going to change, let's say ang ikatulo nga item, which is 565, himo na to 555. So sa matoy mo on, sa to ibutang dere, we are going to write 2. Okay, kay 0, 1, 2. So muna yung index. We're going to assign, let's say 555, and if we're going to print that again, ang Suertres, okay, you notice nalahi. Of course, kanirang nalahi kay mao man ang ato ang gi-specify. So what if, let's say wala to nagibutang? What would be the output? Okay, so sa may nahitabo, okay, what happened here is, okay, it essentially overwritten. Okay, so if you're going to assign, so you should be very careful, okay, in a way that you need to, if you are working on a list and if you want to let's say change an item in our list, you need to know what the index number is, or you need to specify it there. Like kung dili, all of the contents would be erased, okay, it would be overwritten by this by the latest value. In this case, it's a integer value. So if you'll notice, dili na siya list, kaya wala siya nabutang og brackets. Okay, nahimo na lang siya og integer nga value 555. Okay, so you should be very careful when dealing with list. And when to know that you're dealing a list and you're dealing a normal variable, nga na. So how long is a list? Di ba sa kung ani lang dali na ta maihap. Okay? So unsa may length sa list? Okay? So upat ka buok ang iyahang when you are being asked kung unsa kadako or what's the length of a list, okay? You are asked kung pila ka buok tanan sulod ana nga members, okay? Or list item. Okay? So this is another item, this is another item. Okay? Again, they are separated in with commas. Okay? So this is another item, ana. So similar to strings, okay? We could use the len function here. So if you're going to print, let's say, di ba? So we could use len. Then, ngalan sa ato ang list here. So we're going to print that out. Ang mugawas ana is pila man? Upat. Okay? Upat pang kabuok items diha sa atong list. Okay? So that's why 4 ang magpakita diha. Okay, so actually len tells us the number of elements in any set or sequence, such as, okay, again, a string, okay, in this case a list, then other types of collection. Okay, so parehas ani, di ba? Let's say we have the word greet, then hello, di ba? So we have been using a len to know the number of characters of a certain string. So you could simply write greet, should enclose that as part of our parameter in our function. So if you're going to print this out, okay, of course the 4 here corresponds to this length here, and the last print or the second print out is kaning length ani. Okay, as you get to see, na yung mga functions yun nga magamit in between list and strings. So using the range function kani, I think some of you have used this when you are tasked to know the even number. So katong na yung mga numbers bitaw, let's say from a certain range you print out the even, the odd, kana, diba? So some of you might have used the range function. Okay? So the range function returns a list of numbers that ranges from 0 to 1 less than the parameter. Okay? If you notice, it's very similar to how a list is indexed. That is why range function is also commonly used when dealing with list. But remember, ang iyahang i-return ani is ang values from 0 to the 1 less than the parameter. Okay? So you have been using this. Okay? You might have used this when you were tasked to get the range of, let's say, ingani. Okay? Range of, di ba? You might have used this as part of your code, say, from 1 to 10, di ba? So you might have used that as ingani. So if you're going to write 10 here, if you're going to print that out, say if output na ni, what would be the range of numbers that would be printed out? Okay, so the range of numbers that we printed out would be from 0 to 9. It's not 1 to 10. Okay, so we're going to print this out. Oh, okay. Range print range 4. So I think the range function returns a list that range from 0 to 1 less than the. We can construct an index. I think this should not be the output here. Since as you observe, lahi ang iyahang gipakita. But okay, you could actually iterate. Okay, so going back to the scenario, diba? So let's say for x in range 10, print x. let's try on say output ani. Okay, so as I get to see, ano you would be presented with a values from 0 to 9. Okay? Kana. So that is why, okay, kung 1 to 10, I think there is an additional, so we could 4x ano. So if you're going to print this out, okay. So what happens here is it would shift, okay? If you're not going to specify, okay, let's say the first one parameter here, okay, it would return 0 yung starting point, then 1 less than the, okay, 1 less than the value of the parameter, which is 9. That is why if we're going to use this, 0 to 9 na siya. But if you want to specify, okay, if you want to specify, let's say the starting range, okay, inyong ibutang diha. Okay, then let's say di man malahi ang behavior ani, it will always be until 1 less than the parameter here, okay, or 1 less than the number that you have set as the limit. That is why kung ato aning i-print 1 to 9 na gyapon. Kung gusto ninyo na nga from 1 to 10 yun, so inyo na lang nahimon nga ana. Okay? So that would be specifying 1 to 10. So you might have been using range for that. So I think this is I believe this is wrong. So kana, if you want to, well, let's print that out again. So print range. I might have made a mistake, but I think if I'm going to save this, then okay, so still the same output as previously. Singana. Ang buot siguro pasabot niya ni is okay, it would be a list of numbers from 0 to 1 less than the parameter. Okay? So kana. So we could also use, okay, remember this would the parameter of a range would be an integer. So we could also, let's say, balik na sa itong barkada nga example. Okay? So Juan, itong original nga barkada, Pedro, then Maria. Okay? Diba? If we're going to print the len of this, so expect that we get to have a value of 3. Okay? Tulo man kabuok ato ang item, members ato ang list ana, or atong list item. Diba? So 3. If you're going to use, let's say, range sa ato ang ingani. Okay? So I'm going to save this, then make this run. So 0 to 3. But let's try, okay? Let's try putting that here if the same rabang output. Okay, so the same. So this is definitely a wrong output of this code here. So just keep that in mind. So kana. So what happened here is it's diba 0 to 3, but remember, okay, the actual values would be, okay, if atoan ng, let's say if we're going to assign this to n, okay, then we're going to iterate n. So for I in n, so print I. So gusto naman ito ma-identify kung unsay contents sa ato ang range, di ba? So remember, unsa ni? Mao ni atong iterating variable in which it is used to extract a certain value in a collection or in a list, okay, or in a range of values, okay, gikan sa sugod padulong sa ulahi. So ato ang ginahimuan is ato ang gina-pull out ang mga data sulod ani which has been identified here, okay, based on this list item here. So if we're going to make this run, so 0, 1, 2. Okay, so just some application, some, let's say, association that we get to see, and consequently, okay, kanipod ang 0, 1, 2 mao po ang index diha. Okay, so this could be one way of, okay, let's say, if it's required sa inyong code nga i-pull out ang mga indices sa inyong list, then you can use this, but of course there are more efficient way of doing so, but nevertheless it solves that problem kana. So that is the range function. So a tale of two loops. Okay, so let's try first to make this work. We're going to use this same. So for unahon nato ning kani, for I believe this would work as it is. Kanya lang. Okay, let's just use the code, okay, in order. So for, let's say, friend in Barkada, okay, since we are using this, so print happy birthday. Then ang ngalan sa to ang friend, which is identified by this iterating variable here. Okay, so if we're going atawasan ning padagan, we're going to make this run, okay, maragi hapon. Now if you're going to use this for I in range len, actually these two loops here will arrive with the same output, in which ingani ra gyapon. Okay, but remember, in programming there are different solutions. There are, most of the time, okay, there are different solution for the same problem. It would only matter with, let's say, efficiency, readability, and ingana. So in the world of programming, so it's not always the case nga kung kana inyong solution nakuha niya ang problem na answeran niya. It's not always the, let's say, efficient nga solution. Okay, depende na dayon na sa requirement na dayon sa inyo ha. Okay, so if as long as makuha ninyo saktong answer, okay ra, so be it. But if you are being tasked to make a solution that is as efficient as possible, then you need to dive into the technical details on how your code would affect the let's say the memory optimization, or how your code is being performed by the computer itself. Okay, so nga na, but going back, okay, using this type of, let's say, looping statement, essentially we arrive with the same output. This should not be friends kay unsa man ang atoang, that's why it's You should be mindful ha kung ano bitang naimurag mga maging aning o magpakita sa inyong mga editor. It tells you that something is wrong. Okay, something is wrong with your code. You might be using a different variable from another. So in this case, I should not be using friends here. I should be using since we are referring to the list that we are dealing with, so barkada dapat itabot ng diha. Kana. So print happy birthday atong gamiton dire. So when you are practicing, it's also nice nga murag lahi-lahion ninyo. Lahi-lahion ninyo ang example. Let's say, bisag ang print out lang para ma-identify yun ninyo nga, diha din na nalahi. Nga na. Okay? So if I'm going to, tawasan na ikaw na. If I'm going to comment this out, di ba mao ni magpakita? Okay? If I'm going to comment this, then kani ato ang ipadagan. So save this, clear this out. So I get to see parehas ra. Okay? So we are using a different solution for the same problem. But how is it being done? So there, it's much I could say that this is a more intuitive, a more, let's say, a friendlier way, okay, a more readable way of doing so, diba? So for friend in friends, okay, ihan ang i-print dito. Dire, what you're doing here is you are first pulling out the individual. Remember katong giingon kanina nga naay more consequent nga nahitabo atong nagamit ag range o len sa ato ang example earlier. So mao ni, okay? Dire inyuhang gi-pull out ang mga indexes or mga indices. Okay, ang values ng indices which is from 0 to 2. So 0, 1, 2. Then inyong gihimo dire is inyuhang identify ang friends nato, okay, using the index or this iterating variable that you pull out in every iteration, diba? So in the first iteration, this should be friends 0. Then inyong gihimo is inyuha dayon ang gi-assign dere so that in every iteration kaning friend dere nga variable, you get to use that as an individual printout in that iteration. So medyo naay murag additional step na hitabo dere. Kay dere murag gikuha na niya diretso. Kay gikuha na niya diretso sa list, gi-pull out na niya. Dere ihapang gikuha pa niya ang index number, then gikuha niya dayon ang individual nga members sa atong list using this index operator here. Okay, using the name of the list, then index operator gi-assign niya sa usa ka variable, then kana dayon nga variable iyang gigamit diha. Okay? So, kana. So, you're free to use in this level of programming. So, pwede ra ning bisag asa. Again, I would recommend this in terms of readability. Okay? Naman pa uban pod nga murag mo prefer pod ani kay murag technical gyud kaayo ang pagpakita, but then again, it depends really. Okay? So, either way, okay, you could use this loops for achieving the same goal. To make the video short na lang, okay, since we are already almost an hour in this part of our chapter. So ato na lang ning ikat ang atong discussion. Okay? So hopefully na-digest ra ninyo. Okay? Medyo nailibog ani nga part in a way nga magamit ta og brackets, okay, when we are identifying and when we are going to specify a list, okay, and also when we are going to access it, when we are going to access it. Okay, so kana lang inyong timan-an, then kana. So we'll continue with siguro part 2 of our topics about list. So we'll be talking about concatenation and other list methods that we get to use. Okay, so see you next video.